Welcome to another Church History 2 class. It's good to be with you. It's good to have you. And I am enjoying the class. I enjoy studies. I enjoy studying. I enjoy gaining new knowledge and more knowledge. I really enjoy these things. I trust you are enjoying acquisition of knowledge as well. Let us pause a prayer. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for your goodness and your grace towards us. Lord, morning by morning, your mercies I see. Great is thy faithfulness. I bless you, Lord. I invite your presence here, your guidance, your keeping care, your tender mercies. Lead me, Lord, in paths of righteousness. Deliver me from evil, Lord. I pray, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, that you take full control of me, even now, and the participants in this course, and the systems that are engaged to make this course possible. In the precious name I pray, amen. We're going to be looking at the uh, humanists, biblical humanists. We are still looking at the opposition facing the papacy. Renaissance scholars north of the Alps had in common with their brethren south of the Alps a love for sources from the past, an emphasis on human beings as individual entities with a right to develop their own personalities, and an interest in the powers of the human mind to interpret the data that the senses brought to it. However, they were not so much interested in the classical past as they were in the Christian past. They studied the biblical documents in the original tongues as much or more than they studied the writings of Plato or Aristotle. So Italy is north of Germany, is south of Germany. And the Alps, the huge mountain range, separate them. Whereas the scholars in Italy, and they think of Italy as the headquarter of the church at the time, the Roman Church, right? And yet they on that side of the Alps, including the Pope and popes, succeeding popes, were more interested in studying the classical past, the secular classical past, rather than the biblical past, or the Christian past. All right. They studied the biblical documents in the original tongues and so on. Their emphasis was on the Jewish Christian heritage rather than on the Hellenistic heritage of Western Europe. They were essentially Christian humanists who applied the techniques and methods of humanism to the study of the scriptures. They were more interested in man as human being with a soul than they were in him as a rational creature. Their humanism was ethical and religious, whereas that of their Latin brethren to the south of the Alps was more aesthetic and secular. 1. Although what has been said of the Italian humanists was true of the majority, there was a small group in Florence led by Marsilio Ficino, who had fallen under the influence of Savonarola. Marsilio translated Plato's writings into Latin from 1463 to 1477. These humanists wished to integrate the Bible with Greek philosophy, particularly that of Plato. In an effort to achieve this aim, they began a study of the Bible from the literary viewpoint of the humanists. Financial aid from the de Medici family made possible to Platonic Academy in Florence, where Christian humanists might pursue their studies. John Colet from England, Jacques Levere from France, and Roulin from Germany all spent some time at the academy studying the secular past. Two, although Levere used a literal and spiritual interpretation of the Bible in writing his philosophical work on the Psalms, he did emphasize the study of the text of the Bible. About 1512, he published a Latin commentary on Paul's epistles. His work helped to pave the way for the rise of the Huguenots when the influence of the Reformation reached France. Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, better known as Cardinal Ximenes, the Archbishop of Toledo, Spain, became Isabella's confessor and was for some years, the Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. He founded the University of Alcalá to train clergy in the Bible and published the first printed Greek New Testament by 1514. In addition, he supervised the completion of the Complutensian polyglot of the Bible. So you see, on that end, northern and western end, religious scholars were busy working on the Bible and so on. John Colet, Dean of St. Paul's Church, was one of a group in England who were known as the Oxford Reformers. After his visit to Italy, Colet began in lectures to develop the literal meaning of the Pauline epistles. This was an innovation because former theologians had been more interested in allegory than they were in what the writer of the scriptures was trying to say to his or a later day. The work of the Oxford Reformers was a contributing factor in the coming of the Reformation in England. Yes. Oh, my. Roulin and Erasmus were, however, the most influential of the humanists because the influence of their work was felt all over Europe. John Roulin had studied under Pico della Mirandola in Italy and had developed a taste for Hebrew language, literature, and theology. The fruit of his scientific study on the Old Testament was a combined Hebrew grammar and dictionary, which he called Of the Rudiments of Hebrew. This work, completed in 1506, helped others become familiar with the tongue of the Old Testament so that they could study that book in original language. It is interesting that Roulin gave advice concerning the education of Melanchthon, Luther's right-hand man and the first theologian of the Reformation. Desiderius Erasmus, remember we're looking at the biblical humanist, was even more influential than Roulin. He had received part of his early education in the school of the Brethren of the Common Life in the Inventor, and later studied at many of the universities of Europe and England. He became a universal scholar who was at home in cultured circles in any land. His scholarly spirit inclined him to reform rather than revolution. And his opposition to the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church was expressed in his book, The Praise of Folly. And familiar colleagues, In these books, Erasmus attempted by clever satire to point out the evils of life, of the priestly and monastic hierarchy. The humanists satirized, and the reformers denounced evils in the church. The positive, the positive aspect of his work was the Greek New Testament that was published in 1516 by the publisher Froben of Basel, who was desirous of getting the fame and market that would accompany the publication of the first printed and published Greek New Testament. The Spanish scholar Ximenes had had a Greek New Testament printed in 1514, but he could not sell it until the Pope approved. Froben urged Erasmus on. Erasmus used 4 Greek manuscripts which were available at Basel, but when he found that the last few verses of Revelation were missing in all of them, he translated the Latin back into what he thought the Greek should be. The influence of the book was tremendous, for scholars were now in a position to make accurate comparison between the church that they saw in the New Testament and the church of their day. The comparison was decidedly unfavorable to the latter. Yes. At first, Erasmus sympathized with Luther, but later he opposed him because he did not desire the break with the Roman Catholic Church that Luther was forced to make. Now, this is the thing, and this spirit, this attitude prevails to the present time. Here is a church, a religious organization that is corrupt, that is wrong, that is left of center of the Bible, that is evil. The practices are evil. But there are those who don't want to make a break from it. There are those who even collude with it. There are those who even cover the evils thereof. Erasmus's Handbook of the Christian Soldier was an ethical approach to Christianity. He put his stress on ethics. Moreover, his theology differed greatly from that which Luther held. In his book, Free Will, he emphasized the reform of abuses rather than an attack on doctrine, and upheld the freedom of the human will, which Luther said was completely bound as far as goodness and salvation were concerned. In both northern and southern Europe, the Renaissance had lasting results. The study of the classical pagan past led to a secular approach to life in which religion was reduced to a formal affair, or ignored until one came to the hour of death. The ideal of the person as an independent human being with the right to develop as his tastes led him took precedence over the medieval ideal of one who was to be saved by taking his humble place in the corporate hierarchical society of the Roman Catholic Church. I read it again. The ideal of the person as an independent human being with the right to develop as his tastes or desires led him took precedence over the medieval ideal of one who was to be saved by taking his humble place in the corporate hierarchical society of the Roman Catholic Church, not even knowing what is going on. You have no personhood. You have no individuality, no independence. The impetus given to the use of the vernacular by the scholars and poets of the 14th and 15th century Europe was helpful later in bringing to the people the Bible and the services of the church in their mother tongue. The return to sources of culture from the past and the scientific study of them made possible a far more accurate knowledge of the Bible than had been the case before this time. In the political realm, the amoral note struck in Machiavelli's Prince led to the ignoring of moral principles in the conduct of the foreign affairs of the city-states of Italy and the rising nation-states of Northern Europe. One who seeks a balanced view of the impact of the Renaissance can call it neither a tragedy nor an unmixed blessing, but will have to consider it a mixture of blessing and bane to the people of Europe. Blessing and bane. In addition to the development of man's interest in himself as an individual with a mind and spirit, the Renaissance resulted in the development of a wider knowledge of man's physical universe. Man became interested in his environment as well as in himself, and scientific and geographical studies led to a new world of science and to an increased knowledge of how large man's world actually is. The beginning of geographical exploration was again the work of the Latin people. Prince Henry of Portugal sent out explorers from Portugal until Vasco da Gama discovered the way to India around the southern tip of Africa. Prince Henry of Portugal sent out explorers from Portugal until Vasco da Gama discovered the way to India around the southern tip of Africa. It took some time and some bravery and so on for him to really make that discovery. And when that was made, another world was opened up. So man had become interested in his environment as well as in himself, and scientific and geographical studies led to a new world of science and to an increased knowledge of how large man's world actually is. Mhm. Columbus, 1445 to 1506, made the Western Hemisphere known to the world, and his work was speedily supplemented by that of French and English explorers, all of whom were seeking a shorter route to the wealth of the Far East. Copernicus and Galileo also made men conscious of the immensity of the universe about them, and the invention of the telescope and its increasingly effective use substantiated their earlier theories. The classical world had been dominated by the ideal of the city-state as the largest political unit into which people might organize themselves. So we're going now to the rise of the nation states and the middle class. So the classical world had been dominated by the ideal of the city-state as the largest political unit into which people might organize themselves, not no empire. Even the Roman Empire was simply an expansion of the city-state of Rome. Anyone who became a citizen of Rome, no matter where he resided. The Middle Ages was dominated by the concept of political as well as spiritual unity, and in theory, all men were to be united in a new Rome, the Holy Roman Empire. In practice, however, feudalism with all its decentralization gave security and order in chaotic periods. The revival of towns prior to the Renaissance created strong city-states in Italy, But the future in Europe was the nation state as a form of political organization. England, France, and Spain were pioneers in the development of nation states. The development in England was along the lines of a constitutional monarchy in which sovereignty was shared by the monarch and parliament. The bodies representing the people in Europe and Spain never became as powerful as Parliament in England. The bodies representing the people in France and Spain never became as powerful as Parliament in England, and France and Spain developed as centralized nation states in which the ruler was absolute. As cities grew and commerce developed, a middle class arose, and they wanted a share in political and religious life, which means certain structures will have to break up. Hence, this spirit is going to lead to the French Revolution and the revolution in England. It took some time, and changes do take time. You have to talk and talk and talk and demonstrate and so on, and offer an alternative to what obtained, in order to pull that off. Because if people, you notice Erasmus agreed with Luther that the church at Rome needed to be reformed. It was corrupt. Luther tried, he went to Rome to meet the Pope, to work for that. He was warned and practically sent away from Rome that they would kill him. They had killed others. They were not afraid, or they were not afraid of anybody coming there to challenge their comfort and enjoyment. So it is not easy to reform an institution, neither political or religious. Not easy. And at times, in order to get the reformation, you have to split it and split off from it. The rise of the English nation state. The English Parliament grew out of the feudal assembly known as the Curia Regis. Feudal assembly, which is now Parliament, known as Parliament. That was introduced into England during the reign of William the Conqueror, served as a high court and advisory body to the king, and as a money-granting body when the king asked for more than the standard feudal grants. His powers were strengthened by the signing of the Magna Carta by John in 1215, the signing of the Magna Carta, giving more powers, granting more reforms. John agreed not to level new taxes without the consent of the Curia Regis, and to permit the barons to rise against him if he violated the charter. Justice was to be administered fairly, and people were given the right to be tried before those of their own class. Although this document benefited only the feudal class at the time, it did introduce the principles that the ruler was limited by the law and that taxes could be levied only by consent of those taxed. In 1295, Edward I called the Model Parliament, in which representatives of the countries or the counties and the cities were present, as well as the feudal lords and great churchmen. Parliament. So Parliament grew out of that. And also the Privy Council. The two former groups developed the House of Commons, and the last two groups eventually formed the House of Lords. During the 14th century, the king's need of money led to the development of the law-making powers of Parliament, since the members of Parliament would not grant the king desired revenues unless he would sign their petitions or bills, which then became law. So we have what is coming out of the tradition of the Magna Carta of 1215, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Justice was to be administered fairly, and people were given the right to be tried before those of their own class. Although this document benefited only the feudal class at the time, it did introduce the principle that the ruler was limited by the law and that taxes could be levied only by consent of those taxed. So they were talking about two institutions coming out. The House of Lords would compare with our Senate, and the House of Commons would compare with our Parliament. So we have two groups here. The feudal lords, so they would comprise that, and then they were the groups of the city people. Or the great churchmen. The representative parliament to which the king's ministers were responsible was only one of the foundations of English constitutional monarchy. In the reign of Henry II, the common law, which protects the liberties of the individuals better than Roman law does, and the jury system were developed. The individual thus had protection against the arbitrary acts of the ruler. And that is very important. The 100 Years' War with France, 1337 to 1453, served to create English national pride as the English yeoman archers with their longbows found that the arrows could defeat the French mounted knights. And the final loss of territories held by the English ruler in France tended to draw the upper and lower classes together into national unity. The War of the Roses in the third quarter of the 15th century led to the wiping out of the old feudal nobility and made possible an alliance between the king and the middle class in the state. The middle class, in return for order and security, willingly granted money and authority to the rulers. The freedom of the 15th century parliament gave way to the veiled despotism of the Tudors, who ran the state along Machiavellian lines during the 16th century. They did, however, keep parliament to secure popular backing for their kings. We're going to break here, and I want you to do your reflection, research what you don't understand, do your reflection and email me or upload to the classroom. God bless you.